In this video, we'll speak to Katharina on the subject of arts and antiquities. We'll hear from Katharina the role that arts and antiquities can play in financial crime. We'll hear about some of the challenges posed by this sector and some of the steps industry is taking to overcome these.
So Katharina, thanks for joining me this morning to talk about the arts and antiquities field and how that field relates to financial crime. Having a look at your resume, you certainly have a wealth of experience in this area, so we're really looking forward to hearing your take on some of the financial crime concerns and some of the steps the industry's taken to mitigate them. So one of the first things that jumps out on your resume is the fact that you are a PhD student at the moment with the University of Glasgow in studying arts and antiquities. I'm really interested in this area myself, so it would be great if we could get a flavour of what your research is.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do so. So I started my PhD with the University of Glasgow actually in 2017. So the basis of the research is really the theoretical research around the money laundering. So why is it crime? What are the laws and regulations? What's the effect of money laundering? Is it actually, is it worth having it as a crime? What's its history? And around the art market as well. So what is the art market? What's art? Is there art outside the art market? How big is the art market? Are there any specifics, any practices, and what are the challenges? Who's actually an actor in the art market? So the purpose, the entire purpose of the research is actually to answer what is art-related money laundering and what does it look like? Because there's not that many cases, so we don't actually have that much of an idea what it could look like, how is it used, and then to answer the questions whether the current regulatory framework is actually effectively covering money laundering through the art market.
Wow.
So yeah.
There's a lot going on in that research and a lot of really valuable questions. I think that here in Canada, certainly we don't have a lot of discussion about the use of arts and antiquities as a vehicle for money laundering. So it would be great at this point to hear some of the what you consider some of the financial crime risks and challenges associated with the arts and antiquities market.
So I think there are certain practices in the art market that are perfectly normal and most of the time probably are also normal, but that pose a risk that can be exploited by money launderers. So I think an example that always also goes through media and everything is the price volatility. So it's not, art doesn't really have a price tag that stays the same. So art can mean a lot to different people. It has a different value than just monetary value. So there's a difficult concept of how much is it actually worth. How much is it worth to a specific person? So, for example, the concept of a public auction is actually to get the best possible price at the time of the auction. So it depends very much on the room. If you are lucky enough as an auctioneer to have two people in there that they could be competitors, they really want to have that piece, the price is going to go through the roof, which is perfectly normal. And then the next auction, it might not even sell. So through that price volatility, it's easy to hide money, basically. The other thing is, and that always comes up as well, is anonymity. So traditionally, the buyer and the seller of an artwork, they're not known to the public, which, it doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. It's just, it is a risk, and it is a risk that can be exploited. So a lot of the sales go through intermediaries. Also, the problem of not all the information is in the auction catalog. So I think that's what a lot of academics criticize, that, for example, provenance information, which is really important to know whether an artwork has been stolen or whether it was trafficked, it's not in the auction catalog, which has to do with an auction house being a business and needing to sell stuff, and the auction catalog being a marketing tool. So a lot of decisions are made concerning the buyer, concerning the seller, concerning the artwork that have the purpose of making it better to sell, but not necessarily they're normal in the art market, but they pose a risk because they can be exploited. So.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that leads really on to my next question, because you mentioned several aspects there, the price volatility, the anonymous nature of the transactions, and you said a lot of these are completely normal, they're expected behavior in the art world. For a financial crime professional maybe working in transaction monitoring or working in the compliance space, how can a professional identify what is expected versus what could potentially be money laundering?
So I think that's actually the million-dollar question, because as of now, we don't really have an answer to it. And there are projects going on. I know of one in the US, I know of one in the Netherlands. I myself am thinking about that. Because knowing what financial service institutions are looking for in their transactions. So for example, if you look at the cases that we do know, one of the patterns is the use of a straw man, but that's something that we are already looking for in our transaction monitoring programs, right? The same goes for round dollar amounts, money coming in, going out, same amounts, stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that we are already capturing that's not necessarily linked to the art market. And then the question is, we as a bank, what do we actually see in a transaction? So of course we have the name of the beneficiary, we've got the name of the person remitting the money. So there's something that you can sort of compare to a list of art market actors, but it's not really bulletproof. And the next thing is, a person is not just going to write in the reference text, this is for painting X, right? And then even if they did, there's so much more art than just the painting. There's coins, there's carpets, there's all of that stuff that auction houses sell. So I think as of now, we don't really have an answer to that question. We need to analyze more cases. I think I myself have a database of about 20 something, which is just not that much. And so I think there's different ways you can approach that question, but it's still a question.
Yeah. You mentioned a number of different jurisdictions which have projects going on which are looking into this area. In terms of the exploitation of the arts and antiquities sector, are there any differences in jurisdiction which you've observed or which you're aware of?
Well, we do have different regulatory frameworks. With the 5th EU directive that just came into force in January, we have art market actors now covered. They have to perform the same KYC, for transactions starting with 10,000 euros, I think. And I know there's like that initiative in the US as well to add art market actors to BSA, but so there's a couple of regulatory frameworks that would change things, because I think we need to approach it from both sides, from the financial service institutions that just see all the transactions, but also from the art market actors. But from the cases that I've seen, there's not really, I think what I did see is that people use their home countries more than they use, other countries, but that's not really any differences between jurisdictions.
Do you mention a few of the regulatory aspects, the fifth directive, the initiative in the US? In terms of those challenges you mentioned before, in terms of price volatility and anonymity, obviously those auction houses are aware of the financial crime risks that their clients may pose. Aside from those mandated regulatory requirements, what other steps have actors in the arts and antiquities sector taken to mitigate some of the risks? So
there are self-regulation initiatives. For example, there's the Responsible Art Market Initiative in Geneva. They promote due diligence measures, not only related to money laundering, but also to the artworks, because like a big problem is also antiquities trafficking of stolen art. So the due diligence measures also go for the artworks as well. there was, however, so I know that most of the bigger auction houses, they have compliance procedures in place, but there was actually a US Senate report that just came out, I think a couple of weeks ago, that showed that these aren't actually that effective, at least in the case that they analyzed. So I think that's always the problem with self-regulation. Of course, it's good that they're doing it, and it's good that they're aware of it, but the question is just how effective they are.
And that's a nice segue actually to my next question on effectiveness, because I notice from your resume, you actually have two roles. Aside from being the Arts and Antiquities PhD student that you are and extremely knowledgeable on, you also are a leading auditor for Commerzbank in the areas of anti-money laundering and sanctions. And when I first saw this, I thought, wow, this is such a departure from Arts and Antiquities. So I'm really curious to hear how your day job has an impact on your studies, and how the role at Commerzbank relates, if it does, to your research.
So I think, well, obviously topic-wise, it does relate to my research. So it gives me a lot of knowledge, actually. It gives me practical insight in how we are dealing as a bank with regulatory requirements, how we think about risk, how we comply with all the regulations. So it gives me knowledge about the money laundering typologies that we are looking at, how we are analyzing money laundering cases. So it gives me a lot of practical insight in, and also, in just how one of the required parties basically deals with all the regulations. And the other thing is, I think, the skill set. So I think a lot of auditing is analytical thinking, considering risk, considering what would happen, asking questions. And so I basically take that to my research also. So when I read something, I just, I catch myself just constantly asking questions and questioning everything and connecting dots and everything. So I think it actually gives me a lot for my research as well.
Perfect. I mean, a lot of really transferable skills you've mentioned there. Those analytical skills, the soft skills, the research skills. I'm really quite curious in the role you have as an auditor, where you're looking at anti-money laundering and sanctions. I wonder how can the arts and antiquities market exploit or overcome sanctions?
That's actually the topic of the US Senate report. So they had a case where a sanctioned party circumvented sanctions by buying art. And the thing is, I think, especially in the US, the OFAC actually just started thinking about the arts and antiquities sector. So I think, if I remember correctly, in December last year, they added an art dealer from Beirut to their SDN list, to their sanctions list. And they also added a couple of FAQs with relation to the art market, basically saying that you can't just hide money in or circumvent sanctions in, financial products, but also in artworks. And so that one case that they analyzed, the sanctioned party, I think a couple of days after they were added to the sanctions list, they made a couple of purchases at Christie's, Sotheby's, the bigger auction houses, circumventing sanctions. So I think it's an important thing. And, that's also something that there's so many art market actors that are actually really small, and for them to screen all their customers, all their transactions against sanctions lists is actually a really big thing. So, but I think they are going to have to do it eventually.
Excellent. I'm still really curious about the fact that you have this almost double life of being an auditor for a leading bank and a student examining arts and antiquities. Taking both these roles together, with your experiences in both fields, what advice would you give to a financial crime professional who is maybe working in a financial institution, who's maybe seeing some of the transactions related to art houses coming through, who maybe they don't have that level of knowledge and understanding about how the arts and antiquities market works? What advice would you give to them, and what type? And we touched upon it briefly earlier. What type of transactions, if we can identify them, could be considered suspicious or at least worth a second look?
So I think collaboration between financial crime professionals and the art market would be key, actually. A couple of years ago, colleagues actually approached me when they were doing source of funds, source of wealth analysis, and just couldn't. So, for example, it's not that easy to answer that, actually, because there's not like this is a basic art history course that you take and then you know how everything works. It really depends on the market, and it's also changing a lot. Like the taste is changing, the prices are changing. So, for example, with that case, they were actually, so source of funds, source of wealth analysis was done, and the money came from selling a Russian painting. And so for me, that was actually, that was a red flag, because with Russian paintings, there was a time when there was a lot of fakes going on, prices went through the roof, it was a difficult time. But that's so specific that you wouldn't actually know it unless you were in the market. And also, I've been out of the market, so it might have changed now completely, and new things are coming up. So I think the only way you can actually capture that is by working together and constantly exchanging information. And again, with what you see in a transaction, it's just not enough information that you have as a bank to know exactly. So I think you have to approach it from both sides.
Yeah, that's a really key message I think you mentioned on collaboration. We can't all be experts in every type of sector that we come into contact when we're looking at transactions. I think I think, at least an observation from my perspective, we look at some of the risks you mentioned in the arts and antiquities sector, and I kind of see a couple of parallels with trade-based money laundering. A lot of the same grayness, the documentation side of things. And I was curious, when you spoke about source of funds, source of wealth, I think that's where a lot of our transaction monitoring colleagues could potentially fall down in this sector, because at least I have a hypothesis, a lot of the art clients may have at least from onboarding quite a high net worth, quite a high source of funds. If a financial crime professional wanted to explore this area more for themselves, are there any resources which you would direct them to, or could recommend?
So for the topic of money laundering in the art market, there's a couple of articles, a couple of journal articles, maybe 5 or 6, that are published and that one can learn from. Otherwise, I think just books about the art market already help you understand its ways better. But it's not that much that you can actually read at the moment, I think. Also, maybe the PG certificate in Glasgow, although it's not necessarily all money laundering, it's more about art crime and antiquities trafficking. But it would be a start.
It's always worth having a strong understanding of the predicate offences. So I think that's definitely a good resource. It's certainly one I've looked at before, the PG certificate at Glasgow, and I really do encourage anyone to further their personal development. If we can move the conversation back around onto yourself, I'm still really interested in how working as an internal auditor, having this depth of enthusiasm and passion for arts and antiquities, how you started a career in in internal auditing?
Well, I never thought I would. I never thought I would end up in a bank also. So I always knew I wanted to work with art. My high school was actually an art school, and so studying art history was actually, it was my dream, and I always wanted to work for one of the bigger auction houses. I did my first internship just after high school graduation in an auction house in a smaller German one, and I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. And so when I did a PhD certificate in Chinese art, because actually I studied art history, Chinese and economics, so Chinese, that was sort of logical step. I applied for Bonhams, and through a connection that I made in China and through the PhD certificate in London, I actually got the job, and I thought it was my dream job. And it just turned out it wasn't. So I just, I don't know, I enjoyed it, but it wasn't enough, I guess. So from there, going back home to Germany, it felt natural to apply to consultancy firms, because they are known for taking people that actually haven't, not all people have studied economics. And so a big thing for me was always looking beyond what people have studied and just actually taking the skills that a person has. So I was looking for a firm that actually, had the same approach. And so I met a consultancy firm at a student fair, and we talked, and it just made sense. And that I ended up in audit was by chance, because they told me that I get to travel much. So I picked audit. And with the money laundering, I did a lot of audit work for insurance companies, for other companies, for banks also, and through different areas. But money laundering, I always found the most interesting, so I decided to specialize in that area.
That's a really interesting journey, and it's a journey which is still going on, I think, because I look at the fact that you're working full time in a very demanding role, and yet you're working on your PhD. I know from my time when I was working full time and studying PhD, I look back at that time and wonder how I did it. I'm really curious. Moving into financial institution consultants, working full time. You have made a choice to go back to the education world. How was that?
I think for me, it's just never enough. I don't know if that's a good thing. But after a while, working in a consultancy firm, I just realized that I missed doing research, and I wanted to do more. And so that's how I decided to do the PhD. I think I always wanted to do a PhD. But after writing the master's thesis, it was just like, oh gosh, no. So but like I said, I think for me, it's just, it was never enough. So I wanted to educate myself more.
And would you have any advice or best practices in how to manage a full-time job and being a PhD student?
I'm not sure I'm managing all that well. So, I actually don't work full-time, so I work only 80%. I think with overtime, it's probably full-time. So, but yeah, it's not easy, and I'm not sure I would recommend it, because it does feel like you don't spend 100% on anything. It's just really important, I think, to make habits, to make time. So I've got like reading time assigned to each week that I spent on articles for the PhD. And also just get the priorities straight. So if something important comes in from work, do I want to take it? Is it one of my priorities, or is it a PhD? So yeah, and also make that clear to work or the PhD.
And that's always the challenge, having two masters. I'm really interested. We think hearing your story, it kind of resonates a lot with other people I've spoken to. How how your path into your current role wasn't a linear one. You had had a few other roles and responsibilities along the way. I'm always curious to hear, upon reflection,
Mhm.
if you if if you had any lessons which you observed, or um, any moments of clarity or moments of wisdom about your journey.
Well, this is going to sound really cheesy, but I think it's really about fighting for what you want. I guess that's my most important lesson, because none of the internships that I got, not the first one, not the one in Beijing, I actually ended up working for Poly Auction, which is number 3 now in the world. And a lot of it was luck, but I also tried really hard. So for Poly Auction, for example, I went to every auction house in Beijing and gave them my CV, and I never heard back from anyone. So I just started calling them, and it just happened that Poly Auction was the second one on my list. So I called up the managers, and just one of them was like, "Oh, you're German. I like German cars, so you can come in for an interview." So obviously a lot of it was luck, but it was also just trying and being really annoying to people.
It's about making your own luck sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I guess.
It's to my next question, and you kind of answered it before, so I don't know whether it's a good question to ask. But if someone heard your story and wanted to follow in your footsteps, maybe not going into the PhD if you wouldn't recommend it, but what advice would you give to someone?
Yeah, I think it's the same one. Just once you know what you want, you fight for it. Like I think I've always known that I wanted to study art history, and so many people told me that there's no jobs, and they're right, there is no jobs. But I just figured out, if I really like something, I'm really good at it, and if you're good at something, you're gonna find a job. So yeah, I think the other thing is not to stop learning. So once I decided I wanted to do money laundering stuff, just because I thought it was so interesting, I got all the certifications and stuff and took all the courses that you need. So yeah.
Perfect. And that actually leads quite nicely into my follow-up question. One of the challenges I've observed in my position as a lecturer is there's often a disconnect between the education offerings and the job requirements, especially in the entry-level roles to work in financial crime. You mentioned courses and certifications. If someone was looking to or thinking about transitioning from education into the real world, as it were, what certifications or maybe additional courses have you found to be of benefit?
So I think the basics you get from the ACAMS certificate. Otherwise, I think as a professional, what you need to do is you need to judge situations and say whether they're suspicious or not. So to do that, you need to know what's normal, you need to know what's expected. So like a good thing to read is actually the recent enforcement actions, because it tells you what the weaknesses are that the banks are encountering. It tells you what the regulator is looking for. So it gives you a lot of practical insight into complying with relevant laws and regulations.
It's definitely a recurring theme amongst your answers is continuous learning. Read, try and absorb everything, and that's really my key takeaway from today's session. Is all about knowing what you want, identifying what you want, trying to learn that area. Speaking of the area, and obviously we've looked backwards at your career, at your transition into the audit role, and moving forward into the PhD studentship. I'm really curious, and I asked this question of all the sectors, how has our current COVID-19 situation, how has COVID impacted the arts and antiquities sector, specifically in regards to financial crime?
So I think it's probably similar to other sectors. It's just moved a lot of stuff online. So it's moved a lot of auctions online, and that increases the challenges that you have with online stuff. So KYC practices, anonymity. That's for public auctions. I don't think that the impact for private sales is the same. I think they will probably continue just the way they have before.
Interesting. There's a lot to unpack there with COVID, and I think as time goes on, we'll certainly be looking very closely at the impacts. And that comes to the end of my questions. I wonder if you had any final thoughts or any more words of wisdom. There certainly has been a number of words of wisdom throughout these answers, but is there any final takeaway which you would like those watching this video to take?
Well, I think it's a really interesting area to do research on. So if anyone wanted to start up research to collaborate with, there's a couple of people that look at that field, and but I think we can always need more.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. It's given me a lot to think about. It's re-interested me in the PG certificate program from Glasgow. I just need to find time to do that myself now. But really, I think that a lot of key takeaways which will resonate with students watching this. Constant learning, working on those key skills, those transferable skills, and collaborating. I think that's really a message which resonates across financial crime, is that we are in an era where we have to collaborate more. So really, once again, thanks so much for your time, Katharina.
You're welcome.